The morning of the wedding, the lane to Hadley Court was lined with carriages. They stood 3 deep along the Elm Avenue, lacquered doors catching the October light, coachmen in livery stamping their cold feet beside matched pairs of greys and chestnuts. The Rutherford family had not arranged a modest ceremony. They had arranged a spectacle, and Somersetshire had come to witness it. Ladies in Indian shawls and velvet spencers pressed past one another at the gatehouse. Gentlemen in their best coats nodded to acquaintances across the gravel. Above the great door of the house, a garland of late roses and gilded ribbons had been strung, and it moved gently in the breeze, too cheerful by half for what lay beneath it. Miss Cecily Marsh stood just inside the entrance hall, where the household staff had been arranged to receive guests, and she counted the candles in the chandelier above her head, because there was nothing else respectable to do with her eyes. 24. A footman had climbed a ladder at 7 that morning to light each one, and she had steadied the base of it because Mrs. Rutherford had commanded it, and no one else had been near enough to catch the order. She was the companion to Miss Dorothea Rutherford, who in 3 hours' time would become Lady Ashwick. The wedding was Dorothea's. The house was the Rutherford family's. The candles were not Cecily's concern, except that everything on this morning had become Cecily's concern by the simple logic that she was present and willing was the same as available in a house where the mistress moved like a general and expected the same from her staff. A man in a heavy traveling coat came in from the side passage. He was not a servant, but he was not dressed as a guest. The coat was good wool, plain cut, the kind a working solicitor or a prosperous tradesman might wear for a long road. His boots were dusted, and his hat was pulled low, and he carried nothing. No card case, no gloves, no presentation of himself at all. He moved with a particular economy, the sort a man develops when he has learned that most rooms notice him whether he moves or not, and has decided to make the noticing difficult. Cecily was the only person in the entrance hall who saw him come in. She ought to have summoned a footman. She ought to have called for Mrs. Rutherford's butler, Mr. Purst. Gale, who was even then arranging the order of procession in the morning room, and would have handled an uninvited arrival with cold efficiency. She did neither of those things, because the man in the traveling coat looked directly at her and did not pretend he had not, and his eyes were a deep, weathered gray, and they were exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the road. She crossed the hall, picked up a plate of bread and cold beef that had been set on the side table for the household's use, and offered it to him without ceremony. "Sit down," she said. "You look as though you have come a long distance." He looked at the chair she had indicated, a plain wooden one near the passage door, and then at her, and then without a word he sat. That was the first thing anyone thought of to say to Baron Ashwick on the morning of his own wedding, and Cecily Marsh was the one who said it. She had been companion to Dorothea Rutherford for 3 years. It was work that suited neither her education nor her temperament, but it suited her circumstances. And circumstances in the autumn of her 23rd year had narrowed to a precise and unforgiving point. Her father, the Reverend Thomas Marsh of Linford, had died 18 months earlier, leaving nothing but his library, and an affectionate letter to a bishop who was not in a position to help. There had been a small bequest from an aunt, enough to keep her out of service for a year while she applied to a succession of households, and was declined with varying degrees of kindness. Dorothea's mother had hired her in November, not because she particularly wanted a companion for her daughter, but because the previous one had married a linen draper, and the wedding was in a fortnight, and the inconvenience was acute. To the household at Hadley Court she was simply the companion. Not Miss Marsh, not Cecily, not the clergyman's daughter. With a tolerable French, and an excellent Italian, and more opinion about the condition of a household's library than was strictly warranted, she was the companion. The word carried its own weight, a category that stood at every door, and belonged in none of the rooms beyond it. Dorothea's mother, Mrs. Bree. Adelaide Rutherford had said it at their first introduction with a particular placing quality, a gentle emphasis that arranged Cecily in the household's order as precisely as furniture. "My daughter's companion, Mrs. Brissin." Rutherford had said to a neighbor who called in December, and the slight pause before companion had done everything the word itself required. Cicely had learned, in the month since, to take her meals with the upper household, to sit in the drawing room when no company was present, and to leave it without being asked when the company arrived. She had learned the precise moment at which Dorothea wished to be agreed with, and the precise moment at which she wished to be entertained, and she had given both, with enough grace that Dorothea was fond of her, in the easy, careless way the young are fond of things they have not had to earn. It was not an unkind house. It was simply a house in which she did not exist as a person with particulars. The man who was sitting in the wooden chair by the passage door, eating her bread without apparent hurry, existed as a person with rather too many particulars. She had not recognized him immediately. She recognized him now, because she had seen his portrait in the gallery at the top of the stairs, and the portrait was 3 years old, and painted at a more prosperous moment, but the planes of his face were the same. The jaw, and the deep-set gray eyes, and the faint line of a scar through the left brow, keeled pale and clean. Richard Ashwick, 4th Baron Ashwick of Greybourne, Dorothea's intended bridegroom. The man who was at this moment sitting in a plain wooden chair near the servants' passage, eating bread from her hands. Cicely stood very still. The sound of the house moved around them, footsteps above and voices from the morning room in the particular suspended excitement of a house that has organized itself around a single event and does not quite know what to do with the hours before it. "You know who I am?" he said. It was not a question. "I do, my lord," she said. He looked at her steadily. "And you are not going to alert the household?" "You are," she said, eating the bread first. I thought that should be allowed to finish. Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, but the shadow of a familiarity with the feeling. A man who had once known how to be amused and was noting the distance from it. He took another piece of bread. His hands were steady. Whatever had brought him here in a traveling coat rather than a bridegroom's carriage, it had not broken him. He had merely been compelled to walk towards something he was not sure he wanted, and he had done it anyway, because that was what honor and obligation and a signed settlement agreement required. She did not ask why he had come this way. She did not ask why he had not sent word ahead, or arrived with his own people, or appeared at the formal hour. She offered him more bread instead, and he took it, and they remained in silence for a moment in which the noise of the wedding preparations moved around them, like weather around stone. What Cicely did not know, could not have known from the portrait in the gallery, or the careful conversations she had overheard, was that Richard Ashwick had been abroad. He had left England 14 months earlier, 6 weeks after the settlement agreement with the Rutherford family had been signed, and Dorothea's portrait had been received at Greybourne House, with appropriate expressions of appreciation. He had left for reasons that were his own, that he had stated to his solicitor as urgent personal business, and to his family as an extended matter of the estate's affairs in the north of France, where there were vineyards and a complicated question of inheritance from his mother's side. Both things were partly true, and neither was the whole of it. He had gone because he could not stay, and he could not explain why he could not stay, and those two conditions had made departure not merely possible, but necessary. The whole of it was this: his first wife, Margaret, had died 3 years ago, in childbed, and the child with her. He had been in London at the time, not unreachably away. An hour's ride. He had been in London on a matter of the estate's accounts which his steward had said could not wait, and he had believed his steward because he had not wanted to remain at Greybourne with a wife in the last weeks of her confinement, where every day was charged with a particular kind of dread that he had not known how to carry. He had left because he was afraid, and Margaret had died while he was being afraid elsewhere. And the child with her, and that was the wound beneath every arrangement that followed. The settlement with the Rutherford family had been his solicitor's sensible suggestion. The title needed an heir. The estate was solvent, but only just. She was young and well-favored, and her family's money was considerable. The match made every kind of practical sense. Richard had agreed to it the way a man agrees to a surgery. He knows he needs, understanding the logic, dreading the procedure. Telling himself the dread was beside the point. He had gone to France to outlast the dread. He had returned because the wedding was tomorrow, and then it was today. and the carriage he had engaged had been ready since dawn, and somewhere between the arrangement of his cravat and the moment of stepping into the carriage, he had stepped out of it again and dismissed it, and walked the last 4 miles in a traveling coat, because he needed to arrive without ceremony, and he needed a few minutes in which no one expected anything of him. The companion had given him both. She was standing now at a slight distance, having moved to allow a footman to pass with a stack of pressed linens. Her gown was grey wool, neat and plain, and her hair was pinned in the way of a woman who is dressed without a maid. She was not beautiful in the manner the season catalogued, but she had a quality the season rarely counted, a stillness that was not vacancy, an attention that was not performance. She had looked at him when he came in, and had seen he thought something more accurate than his name. He set the plate on the chair beside him and rose. "I am obliged to you," he said. "You needed to eat," she said simply. "I needed," he said, and then did not finish it. He looked at the entrance hall, the chandelier, the garland above the door that moved in the draught. "Where is Mrs. Rutherford?" "Morning room," Cecily said. "Mr. Gale is with her. If you wish, I can let him know you have arrived before anyone else sees you, and he can arrange a quiet introduction." "Yes," he said. "Do that." She moved toward the morning room without haste, and he watched her go. And there was something in the way she crossed a room that made the room aware of her, though he suspected she did not know it. Mrs. Bell Lye. Rutherford's response to his arrival was precisely what he had expected. She received the news from Mr. Jewes. Gale, in a matter of 12 seconds of silence, followed by a smooth return to command, dispatched 2 footmen to attend to him, sent word to Dorothea's maid, and instructed the household to say nothing to the assembled guests about the nature of his arrival. By the time he was installed in the library with a glass of wine and his own man from Greybourne, who had been waiting anxiously in the servants' quarters since morning, the entrance hall was arranged again as if nothing had interrupted it. The companion had vanished into the machinery of the house. He did not see her again until the wedding breakfast. The ceremony was held in the parish church at the edge of the estate grounds, a small Norman building with clear glass windows and cold flagstones. And Dorothea, in her ivory silk and her mother's pearls, was precise and self-possessed. And Richard said what was required of him, and received what was required of him, and was aware throughout of a particular quality of his own attention, a steadiness that surprised him, as though the 4 miles walked in the cold had settled something that argument had not. He could not have said when he first loved her. He was not sure love was the right word for what had been happening since the morning in the entrance hall, since the bread and the chair and the particular quality of seeing in her grey eyes. He knew only that the word for what he had felt in every formal introduction since his return was want. She was at the wedding breakfast in her capacity as Dorothea's companion, stationed at the far end of the table. Among the lesser guests, the quieter neighbors and the elderly cousin who had come from Taunton, and required careful seating and considerate conversation. She spoke to the elderly cousin for most of the meal with the focused patience of someone who found people genuinely interesting, and had not yet been worn out of it. He watched her twice. He was aware both times of the watching. Dorothea's mother had placed his new wife at his right hand, and arranged the table accordingly, and Dorothea was charming and pleasant, and exactly what he had agreed to in the settlement, and he was courteous to her, and to her cousins and to the 3 neighbors who wished to discuss the state of the roads between Somersetshire and Bath. He did all of it. He was present for all of it. The elderly cousin from Taunton, a Mrs. Fenwick, was saying something at the far end of the table, and the companion was nodding, and then she said something in return that made Mrs. Fenwick laugh, a genuine surprised laugh, and the companion's face in the candle light, with the laugh's reflection in her expression, was the truest thing in the room. After the breakfast, the guests moved to the drawing-room, and Richard accompanied his wife and his new mother-in-law through the correct order of presentation. He was steady through all of it. He had expected to be less steady, and the unexpected steadiness was its own small comfort. It was near 5 in the afternoon when the guests began to thin, the carriages collecting in the drive in the fading light, and Richard found himself near the library door, talking to the Rutherford family's solicitor, a Mr. Caius Haddon, about a minor clause in the settlement that required clarification before the new year. The companion was in the corridor beyond, speaking to a maid about the arrangement of the upstairs rooms, her voice low and efficient. He caught a word, a direction about a particular guest's hat that had been left in the blue sitting room, and the maid moved off. And Cecily turned and found him standing 3 feet away. She did not startle. She simply looked at him and waited. "Miss Marsh," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She had heard it from Dorothea and from Mr. Rachin, Gale, and from the footman who had passed through the entrance hall that morning, but not from him. "My lord," she said. "I wish to thank you again," he said. "This morning there is no debt," she said. "Anyone would have done the same." He disagreed with this entirely. He had stood in rooms full of people who would not have done the same. He had stood in this house for the better part of a day, and observed the considerable number of people who did not see what was in front of them, unless it had been framed for their looking. She had seen him without framing. She had acted without instruction. He did not know how to say this without saying more than a man who had been married that morning could properly say in a corridor at 5 in the afternoon. "Nevertheless," he said. She looked at him with that direct attention, the kind that did not hunt for something to say, but simply permitted silence to be silence. "Dorothea is fortunate," Cecily said at last. "To have a man who walks 4 miles to arrive at his own wedding, rather than arriving by carriage and being afraid of it." He was quiet for a long moment. "You observed more than I thought. I observe what is in front of me," she said. "I have found it the most honest way to live." He said nothing. She gave him a small nod, the correct formal nod of a companion, acknowledging a superior who has concluded a conversation, and moved away down the corridor. He watched her go for the second time that day. The Ashwick household departed for Greybourne the following morning, and she remained at Hadley Court with Mrs. Rutherford, and the reduced household, and the quiet that falls over a great house after the occasion it has been organized around has finally occurred. She remained there for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, she received 3 notes. The first was from Dorothea, affectionate and scattered, describing Greybourne House, and the views and the particular quality of the guest rooms, and asking for news of her mother. It was a letter Dorothea would have written to any friend she was fond of, and Cecily received it as such and replied with equal warmth and no more weight than the correspondence deserved. The second was from Mrs. Kia. Adelaide Rutherford, written in the careful hand of a woman who has never entirely decided how to address a companion, but who has arrived at a serviceable form. It contained instructions about Cecily's position going forward, now that Dorothea was established, and the instructions were not unkind, but they were conclusive. The companion's role would be reduced to a correspondence arrangement, a monthly letter, and a quarterly visit. And Mrs. Amber Raydon. Rutherford had written to a friend in Bristol about a possible new placement that might suit Miss Marsh's particular experience. Mrs. Rutherford was not wrong to arrange it. There was no longer a position at Hadley Court. Cecily received the letter on a Tuesday and sat with it for an hour, and then wrote a gracious reply and set it on the tray for the post. This was not the dark moment of her life. She had learned to distinguish between a door closing on a room she had merely borrowed and a door closing on something that mattered. The third note came in the 2nd week of December. It was from him. She was alone in the morning room when she read it, in the mid-morning quiet after breakfast, the fire banked and the windows gray with December cloud, and the note was on a small folded sheet. No envelope, the handwriting level and unhurried. The 12 words said, "I should like to speak with you if you are willing. Greybourne." She sat with it for longer than an hour. The note was its own particular problem, because it was proper in form, a gentleman's request, addressed to Miss Marsh, conveyed through Mr. Taine. Gale with the appearance of business, and she could read a dozen things in it and be wrong about all of them. She knew herself well enough to know that she was not an impartial reader. She had thought about the man in the traveling coat more times than was useful, and had recognized the thinking as the specific disturbance that comes when something has taken up residence in a place where nothing was expected to live. She wrote back in the same morning that she would come. She took the post-chaise to Greybourne on a clear December day, the fields along the road silver with frost, and arrived at a house that was larger than Hadley Court, and quieter, in the way of houses that have been organized around one person's long grief, and have not yet been reorganized around anything else. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Calloway, received her with a careful formality that suggested she had been given instructions and was observing them precisely. Dorothea received her in the drawing-room, warm and genuinely pleased, and they sat together for half an hour while Dorothea described the garden in summer and the library, and her own efforts to understand the household's accounts, which she had approached with more energy than accuracy, she admitted, and which the steward regarded with patient apprehension. Cecily listened with real pleasure, because Dorothea, at her best, was genuinely engaging, a young woman who had been given everything and was discovering that some things had to be earned, and was making the discovery with more grace than her mother might have managed. Richard came in at 4 o'clock. He came in while Cecily was standing at the far end of the room, looking at the books arranged on the shelves beside the fireplace, because the quality of a household's library told her things about a household that a drawing-room could not. She heard him greet Dorothea, heard Dorothea say something about a letter from her mother that she would take up before supper, and heard the door close after Dorothea left. She did not turn immediately. She finished reading the spines in front of her, noted 2 volumes of Cowper and a good set of the essays, and one small thin book of verse, Italian, that was placed with visible care at the end of the row. "Miss Marsh," he said, from behind her. She turned. He was standing a proper distance away, and he looked exactly as the portrait had suggested, and exactly as the entrance hall had confirmed, and exactly as she had been remembering him, which was the specific difficulty. He was not handsome in the manner the season catalogued either. He had a face that did not arrange itself for observation, a face that held its weather inside. "My lord," she said. "I am told," he said, "that your position at Hadley Court has concluded." "It has," she said. "I had a thought," he said, "that Greybourne House might require a librarian." She looked at him steadily. "A librarian?" "The library is in considerable disorder," he said. "The previous occupant of the position retired 7 years ago and was not replaced. There are 300 volumes incorrectly shelved, and a catalogue that has not been accurate since my father's time." She looked at the shelves beside her. "These are correctly shelved. These are the ones I arranged myself," he said. "The main library is 2 rooms east." She was aware, with considerable precision, of the warmth of the fire and the distance between them and the silence in which he had said "my father's time," which was a silence that carried something she was not going to look at too directly or it would prevent her from thinking clearly. "A librarian," she said again. "The position would be independent of Lady Ashwick's household arrangements," he said. "A separate income, a separate function. Mrs. Calloway could advise on the domestic particulars." "You are describing," she said carefully, "a position that would keep me in this house." He met her eyes and did not look away. "Yes," he said, "I am describing that." She wanted to ask him why. She wanted to say that she was not certain, that she had spent 3 years learning the shape of doors that closed, and that she was not particularly interested in standing in one more frame and waiting to find out whether it would close again. She wanted to say that the 12 words in his note had arrived during a week when she had been reading the same page of the same book 4 times, and not retaining it, and she knew very well why, and knowing why did not mean the thing was sensible. She did not say any of that. She said, "I should like to see the state of the main library before I agree to anything." He said, "Of course." He walked her to the main library, and it was 2 large connected rooms. And the condition of it was not precisely disordered, but it was the condition of a collection that had been loved by one person for many years, and then left alone to settle into its own arrangements. And she stood in the doorway and felt the same sensation she had felt when the Reverend Thomas Marsh had first unlocked the library at Linford and told her she might read any book on the lower shelves and ask before she attempted the upper ones. "It will take months," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. because he was standing in the doorway behind her, and she could feel the specific gravity of it, the 2 feet of clear air between his chest and her back. "My lord," she said. "There is something I must say before you answer," he said. His voice was low. It was the voice of a man who has chosen each word with particular care. "I cannot promise you that I know the shape of this. I know that the house is better when you are in it. I know that I have been thinking more clearly since December began than I was thinking in October, and I did not understand why, until I received your letter saying you would come." She turned to face him. He was closer than she had allowed herself to estimate. The scar through his left brow was visible, pale and old, and his eyes were the exact gray of October cloud. "You are married," she said. "I am," he said. "I do not propose to be dishonest with you about what I am, or what I can offer. I am telling you that I am asking you to stay because your presence is something I value, and I am asking you to let me find out what that means, in whatever time the world allows for finding out." She was aware of her own heart, which was doing something that had no decorous name. "I will catalog your library," she said, "and we will see." He nodded once, the compact nod of a man who has said everything he knows how to say and is prepared to let the rest be made clear by living rather than by declaration. What the world allowed, in the months that followed, was measured in books and afternoons. She began with the cataloging in January, and the work was more considerable than even her first assessment had suggested. 342 volumes needing relocation, 6 needing repair, 2 needing recovery from a water damage that had occurred some years before and had been addressed with good intention, but insufficient skill. She worked in the mornings, and at the edge of the afternoons when the light in the west room was still useful, and she wrote each title in her neat hand into a new catalog that she had requested from the stationer in the village. Richard came to the library in the afternoons. He did not come every afternoon. He came 3, sometimes 4 times a week, in the hour before supper. And he sat in the chair near the second window and read, or wrote letters, or did neither of those things but simply remained in the room while she worked. They spoke on these occasions about the books, about the state of the catalog, about particular questions of arrangement that required a judgment about what the collection was for. They spoke, gradually, about other things. About his mother, who had been French and who had brought the Italian verse to the library and placed it with that visible care at the end of the row. About her father, and the Linford Library, and the particular quality of a Sunday morning when the church was empty and she had sat in the 3rd pew from the front and read by the east window light. About the war, which had taken people they had both known and which neither of them approached directly, but both of them carried. He did not speak of Margaret. He came near it once, in February, when she asked about the portrait in the gallery, the one she had not yet reached in her cataloging, a woman in a green gown above the fireplace at the east end of the upper hall. He said she was gentle, in a voice that held all the rest of it inside, and she said, "She looks it," and they let it rest there, and moved past it, and later she thought that this was perhaps the truest thing about him, that his grief was not theatrical, and his damage was not spectacular, only specific, and ongoing and entirely human. In March, Dorothea came to find her in the library one afternoon, and sat in the chair near the window and said, without particular emphasis, that she had asked Richard whether Miss Marsh intended to remain at Greybourne permanently, and he had said he hoped so, and Dorothea had thought, sitting with the word hoped, that she would come and ask Cecily directly what she made of it. Cecily set down her pen. "What do you make of it?" she asked. Dorothea considered this with more seriousness than she usually brought to consider things. She was 20 years old and married, and discovering that marriage was a country she had prepared for as one prepares for a particular landscape and found to be a different landscape entirely, with its own weather and its own distances. She was not unhappy. She was not certain. She was in the process of discovering what she was, which was the particular labor of being 20 and new to things, and she was doing it with the kind of industrious good faith that Cecily had always considered her best quality. "I think," Dorothea said, "that he has been less absent since January. I do not know what that means, except that the house is different." Cecily looked at her hands flat on the catalogue. "And you," she said. "What do you wish for?" Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "I wish for him to be present," she said. "He was so far away when I first came, even when he was in the room. I did not know what to do with a man who was in the room and absent from it. Now he is more often present. I think you are part of that. I should hate to be a difficulty between you," Cecily said. "You are not," Dorothea said, with a simplicity that was entirely her own. "You are the only person in this house who has ever told me honestly when a household decision I proposed was mistaken. That is not a difficulty. That is a service." She said it without any awareness that it was generous because she was not aware of being generous. In that moment she simply said, what was true, it was the version of Dorothea that Cecily had always preferred. What happened in the drawing room on the 14th of April was not planned by anyone, and it was witnessed only by the fire and the rain on the west windows, and Mrs. Beat Calloway, who came in with the tea tray and withdrew with the quiet efficiency that characterized her conduct and said nothing to anyone. Cecily had been reading. Richard had been at his correspondence. Dorothea was at the pianoforte working through a piece she had been practicing since February, with the methodical patience she brought to things she genuinely wanted to learn, and the fire was warm, and the rain was steady on the glass. And the room had the quality of a room that has arrived at a particular kind of peace, after having not been peaceful for a long time. Richard set down his letters and looked up, and the looking was not at the fire, or at the rain, or at anything arranged for his looking. It was at her, at Cecily, who had not noticed because she was reading, and then she looked up too, because she had learned, over 3 months, to know when his attention had shifted, without being told. He held her gaze for a moment. She held it back. It lasted the length of a breath, and in that length it contained everything they had not been able to say in the months of books and afternoons and quiet conversation and careful management of an affection that had no proper category in the world as it was organized. He did not speak. She did not speak. Dorothea's piece moved through its middle passage, and the rain gathered on the glass and fell, and the fire pressed its warmth into the room. Then he looked back at his letters. She looked back at her book. She did not retain a word of the next 3 pages. It was Dorothea who spoke, in the end. Not that evening, not that week, not until a morning in May when the garden had opened, until late bloom and she had come to the library and stood in the doorway and said, with the particular directness that was her best quality, that she had been thinking about the house in the future and whether Cecily intended to remain. "I intend to finish the catalogue," Cecily said carefully. "That will take until July," Dorothea said. "Possibly August. And then—" Cecily did not answer. "I have spoken to Richard," Dorothea said. "I have told him that I think he is in love with you, and that I think it is a difficulty for everyone while it remains unspoken, and that I think we are all 3 of us sensible enough to manage something more honest than what we have been managing." Cecily set down her pen. He said, Dorothea continued, looking at her hands folded in her lap with more concentration than they required, that he did not believe he had the right to say so, while things were as they are. "He is correct," Cecily said. "He is also," Dorothea said, "unhappy in the way that people are unhappy when they are correct about something that costs them something." She looked up. "I am not. That is what I wanted you to know. I am not unhappy. I am not injured. I am a young woman who made an arrangement she understood to be an arrangement, and I should like to manage the arrangement well, rather than pretend it is something else." Cecily looked at her for a long moment. "Dorothea," she said. "I know," Dorothea said a little more quietly. "I know it is not the story I imagined. I am finding out this year that the story I imagined was rather less interesting than the actual one." She rose and went to the door, and then paused with her hand at the frame. "He is in the garden," she said. "He goes there when he cannot think clearly indoors." She left. Cecily sat with the catalogue open before her for the length of time it took the mantel clock to mark the 1/4 hour. Then she rose, set down her pen, and went to the garden. He was standing at the far end near the stone wall where the climbing roses had been trained for 30 years and were only now beginning their spring growth, pale canes and the first tight leaves. The morning was clear and mild, and the light on the garden was the specific quality of an English May morning, everything impossibly green, the sky, a pale, sharp blue. She walked across the grass without hurrying. He heard her, or sensed her, and turned. They stood 15 feet apart. The garden was quiet. "Dorothea spoke to me," she said. He said nothing. His face was still in the way. It was still when something was moving behind it. "She is," Cecily said, "a better person than the world has yet had time to discover. I want you to know that I see that whatever else is true. I know it," he said. She took one step closer. The grass was soft underfoot. "My lord," she said. "Richard," he said. "My name is Richard." It was the first time he had offered it. She received it with the weight it deserved. "Richard," she said, "I have been cataloging your library since January. I have spent 3 months in your house and at your table and in your company, and I'm a very poor liar about what that has been to me." It crossed the remaining distance. He stopped close enough that she could see the gray of his eyes in the morning light. And they were not exhausted now. They were simply direct, the way a man's eyes are direct when he has stopped managing the distance between what he knows and what he is willing to say. "Cicely," he said. It was the first time he had said her given name, and it landed in the specific silence he had created for it. She put her hand in his and felt his grip close around her fingers, steady and deliberate, the grip of a man who has decided. They stood in the garden for a long time. The climbing roses in their first green, the May light on the stone wall, the house quiet at their backs. He did not speak again, and she did not require him to. They had been speaking, she thought, for months in every language but this one, and the words that had finally arrived were plain and sufficient and entirely true. There was no ceremony to the rest of it. There was the house and the catalogue, and the careful and particular task of becoming something new with the materials that were already present. Dorothea remained at Greybourne, and the household adjusted, as households do, to the shape of the people inside it. There were mornings when Cecily brought her catalogue to the drawing room, and Dorothea played, and Richard read. And the rain came in off the moor, and the fire was warm, and the room held all of them without requiring any of them to be different from what they were. The catalogue was finished in August, as she had said it would be. She presented it to him on a Tuesday evening. All 409 volumes correctly entered in her neat hand, the index clear and the condition notes accurate, a record of the collection as it was and as it had been and as it might be, going forward. He received it with both hands. She had written on the inside cover, in her smallest and most careful hand, the title of the Italian verse, the one his mother had placed at the end of the row. It was a line about returning to a house that does not know yet, that it has been waiting. He looked up from the page. She did not look away. That evening, they sat by the west window as the sun went down over the moor, and the catalogue lay on the table between them, and the light moved through the glass and across the floor and gradually failed, and neither of them moved to light a candle, because the dark, when it came, was the dark of a room that contains the right people and knows it. If this story stayed with you, I would be glad to know. Greybourne has been waiting a long time to be a home again. The Italian verse sat at the end of the row, as it always